Hello and welcome back to Ka0s Tournament Podcast. On this episode, we will be talking about what to play to a tournament, what deck to bring, as well as some broader concepts when it comes to tournament deck building and stuff like that. I'm Fetch, and with me today is Kuma.
Yo.
Neko.
Hi, everyone.
And Rook.
Yeah.
So, as we're getting into this, obviously, we're a cEDH podcast. We're going to be talking about cEDH specifically, but a lot of these concepts apply regardless of game. If you're playing a competitive game, you're going to have all of these things really come into play in one way or another. But as we're starting off, we're going to be going for the broad idea of meta picks, basically. There's kind of 3.5 choices that you have as far as what to bring to a tournament. You either are playing what's meta, a counter pick to the meta, a comfort choice, or something fringe. Typically, comfort choice and fringe fall in line, but comfort pick can also go with either counter meta or meta. So, breaking down what is meta, I mean, basically, it's whatever's best at the time. So, cEDH.
Blue farm is meta.
Yeah, blue farm is meta.
Turns out having more colors tends to be better, and blue farm does that, right?
Somebody told Charles he needs more colors.
Yeah. Not only colors, card draw.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Counterpick is talking about whatever is best at beating the thing you're expecting to see most. Which, honestly, whatever is best at beating blue farm, I don't know. I don't know if we found that yet.
No.
Spirit of the Labyrinth.
Other 4-color partner decks or 5-color decks, they can keep pace at least.
I mean, I think an argument has to be made for a deck like Winota. Obviously, it's had a little bit of a rougher time as of late, but obviously being a very different deck to the rest of the meta and kind of being able to apply pressure on it on different angles could potentially, you could at least argue, is in this position.
And I think too, tech pieces outside of just decks, things like Narset we've been seeing, Notion Thief type effects that really affect that card draw, and even the bigger idea of more creatures in the meta, which makes it harder for the Tymnas to swing into.
And tech choices is a pretty huge thing, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. But when I'm talking about fringe choices, that's basically you're playing something that no one is used to, so they don't know how to play against it. Obviously, if a deck gets popular enough, then it's no longer going to be fringe because people know about it. But stuff like back in the day, Magda absolutely fell into this. Magda's become a little bit more popular now, so a lot more people know how to stop it, but it's still fringe enough where you may roll up to a table and people might not know your game plan. That's kind of the main idea behind it.
Yeah.
That surprise factor is actually really important too in a lot of cases. Being able to sit down at a table and have your 3 opponents try to discuss what the heck you have going on there is a fun conversation to listen in on. And surprise factor will get you, especially in bigger tournaments where people are teching more for the more powerful, more well-known decks like Blue Farm. I think Urza's Battlethopter just won a tournament, actually.
The colorless one?
The colorless one.
I keep hearing about that. I gotta actually look at that list because I'm very surprised the colorless deck took down anything.
It's pretty much a meme, but it's a cool meme, so.
Yeah. It plays some cards that are very playable, and it plays some cards that are not very playable. I think it's the simplest way to break it down. I mean, I think it kind of highlights that, right? Like, cEDH is in a very much a state of flux, and I think we kind of talked about it before, right? Where on the right day, any deck can win, obviously within reason, as long as you get the right pods, the right hands, get on a hot streak. If you get a really good hand in some of these decks, you could just be really explosive and take over the game.
And it's not just the decks itself either, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with Comfort, but the pilot skills, the game knowledge
Yeah.
really plays an important factor. Being able to know a deck very well is really good, but knowing the format, knowing the game, being able to sit down at a table, politic, identify the threats, really crucial. And that's why you see people playing these fringe decks, people like Comedian, who can brew a Jetmir commander with his community for a tournament and top 16 with it.
I'm going to say in that case that had more to do with Ian than Jetmir as somebody who's actually played the deck. But yeah, like for sure. I mean, Ian could probably top 16 a tournament with whatever list he wants.
Apart from Winota, apparently.
Yeah, you are not Ian. People out there listening to this podcast. You are probably not brewing something that's going to top 16 a tournament. It could happen,
True,
but if your goal is to win the tournament, sometimes you need a little bit of humility around your ability to brew decks.
Although even with these players that aren't necessarily as established, when it comes to playing something well, we saw with Chris K. Claw taking the most recent Chaos at the time of recording. It really shows how knowing the deck, because yeah, that was his brew, and no one else was talking about Atraxa really before. I mean, there was conversation, but a lot of people just wrote it off as like, oh, this isn't really that good. It's not worth it. And Chris showed that it has some value to it.
I think that's honestly a big part of that is people underestimating Food Chain because they forgot that card's scary, man. It comes out of nowhere. I think people hadn't seen too much first chain Food Chain first sliver. It's been a while since people had kind of seen it. Kazurakima is kind of like, I'd argue, not really a better version of the Food Chain version. But the fact that you've got access to this Atraxa that's just kind of a good card to play, unlike First Sliver, it is really, really nice. And I think we saw like a bunch of times the manual Storm style lines where you play Displacer Kitten, and then every time you cast a spell, you draw 6 cards. That's quite good.
It is. And I think Atraxa herself is really strong. Very good pilot behind it. But even looking back to Captain Sisse that won a recent tournament with us, 2 colors, I would argue that was much more pilot skills. And even before that, pretty recently, was another white-green deck, Sithis deck, that I think top forward another tournament. So those lower color decks can still get there, even if they aren't as strong, if you have a pilot who can bring out their full potential.
Yeah, Choirboy Sisse is the perfect example of what knowing a deck inside and out can do for you. Like, in his primer, he claims to have put in like 2,000 hours playing the deck, hundreds of games. Like, yeah, that he knew literally everything his deck could do, what it needed to do, what it needed to do versus everything. That can get you a long way, even if the deck itself is not the most powerful thing you can be doing.
Well, and that's the perfect example of the comfort pick. It's someone that knows the deck inside and out, knows everything that it does, and that so happened to also fall in Fringe, where other people don't know what you're doing. So you know your deck better than anyone else, and no one else knows the deck either.
That is a recipe for success right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's literally like a Sun Tzu thing. As long as you know yourself and you know your enemy, and if your enemy doesn't know you, like, you're absolutely balling. There's no way you can lose those battles. I don't think he said it exactly like that, but close enough.
I think that's an exact quote. I think you're right on the money there. But as we are talking about this idea using specific examples of people, let's get more applicable to the watcher, general viewer. If you are someone who has a decent amount of experience with cEDH, but isn't one of these top performers, isn't someone who has like 20 million games on whatever deck, if you're going into a tournament, out of those options, meta, counter pick, and I'm going to leave Fringe out of the conversation because that's a whole nother thing, and I wouldn't recommend someone plays Fringe just to play Fringe. So meta, counter pick, and comfort pick. What would you go for? What do you recommend, and for what reasons?
To start, I would say go with comfort for the reasons we've kind of talked about before. You can, and Kuma, you were talking about this earlier, so I won't steal your point too much, but even if you make the good deck your comfort pick, playing something you know and making it something you know very well is very strong.
Yes, absolutely. My advice to new players is, if you're just entering the format and you have none or very few games under your belt, I would definitely start with meta, because at that point you don't even have a comfort pick. Like, you haven't played enough games to be comfortable with any deck. So when you're just starting out, I think you're best served by getting comfortable with the meta. Play something that's done well repeatedly. Play something that everybody knows is strong. Learn it. Even if you decide later you don't like the deck, understanding how one of those decks works will serve you well, because you're more likely to run into that than you are a lot of the fringe decks. So I think the newer you are, the more meta you want to start with. And then when you get a little bit more familiar, you kind of understand the meta game, you understand the top decks, you understand what people are trying to do. Then if you want to go counter pick, I think that makes a lot more sense for you. And then eventually, if you want to move on to that and you want to try the fringe thing, if you really understand what's going on out there and what people aren't prepared for, at that point, I would maybe try to go for a fringe deck. So if you don't have a comfort pick yet, my advice would be start at the top and work your way down until you find something you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I mean, to draw the first of probably many analogies of this one, been learning drumming recently, and I keep asking, right? How do I do this? Very simple, basic thing. You want to build good habits. And I think that's really true with every competitive thing. Everything you're looking to improve at is building those good habits. And generally, obviously it's not an exclusive thing, playing the good decks in a format give you a good idea of what the good habits are, right? What cards are good? Well, they're running all the good cards. So you know that cards that give you card draw, cards that are really effective at shutting down strategies, cards that are A+B combos and can pull out of absolutely nowhere. Obviously, all very strong. I mean, I'm kind of focusing on Blue Farm there. But I think you're absolutely right. Focusing on the meta, if you haven't built any of those habits yet, is a really good way to do it. And then, as you said, if you want to play something more interesting, go for it further down the line. That being said, I would kind of like to point out that if there's something that you really desperately want to play, just play it, right?
Mhm.
If you want to play it, if you're fine with not winning, which frankly, if it's your first tournament anyway, let's be real, you're probably not anyway. Play what you want, play what you enjoy, try to build good habits where you can, but have fun. That's the recipe for success. Make sure you enjoy what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Before anything else matters, as a rule zero, whatever you're playing needs to be something you enjoy. If you're not having fun playing in a tournament and you think that's because you picked the wrong deck, then stop what you're doing and pick a different deck. Like, ultimately, this is supposed to be fun. If you're not enjoying yourself, you're not going to want to practice enough to even get to the point where you win. There's a point that gets brought up in sports a lot where they talk about, the athletes the pros aren't having fun anymore. It's all about the money now. And I just tell people, the pros are probably having more fun doing this than literally anybody else is, because if they weren't having more fun doing it than anybody else, they wouldn't have practiced more than anybody else before they were pros, would never have got the chance to be pros because they didn't enjoy it enough to put in the time and effort necessary to be that good. So yeah, if you're not enjoying yourself, first and foremost, switch it up. Exactly. Because before anything else, the point is to have fun. Now you're having, fun with a bunch of different decks. Then I would go into my advice, start with meta, see if you can have fun playing a meta deck. If you can't, then play something you think will be more fun for yourself.
And I think going with that too, the idea of practice is understanding that this is something that will take time and research on your part. They say you need 10,000 hours before you master something. The good thing about cEDH is there's a ton of great resources online that will help you get started with that. But you can't expect to take the top tier deck. You can't expect to pick up Blue Farm, not get any games in with it, and just go to a local tournament and do well, because you're going to lose and you're going to get frustrated with the deck. You need to really understand the decks that you're playing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you could do that, the format would have a serious problem. If Blue Farm was just that much better than everything else that anybody could pick it up and take a tournament down, that would be a massive problem with the format. And the deck is good, but it's not that good.
Well, and right now, cEDH is in a place for its meta where it's actually really healthy and you can choose a lot of different options and succeed with it. It comes down to pilot skill as well as, to some extent, your tournament preparation. So if you are going to a tournament, especially if it's a big tournament, and you want to actually do well, you do have to go and practice and plan and figure out, okay, what do I want to bring? But also play against what you're expecting to see in the tournament. This comes down to literally anything. If you have people that you can practice with and be like, hey, I know that you are good at this deck. I'm expecting to see this deck at whatever tournament. Can you play it against me so that I can get used to that matchup?
And I would argue even more than playing the matchups, learning the skills to play in a tournament. Like playing against other people is good in most cases, regardless of what deck they're playing, because just knowing what to be like in that setting, learning that you can't take things back, learning that you have to play under a clock will, I think, serve you a lot more long term, because you won't be able to play against every deck. Yes, you can do the powerhouses, the blue farms, the Nagilas, the Winotas, you can get those games in, but you also have to have the skills to handle things you aren't expecting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Neko, because I wanted to push back on what Fetch said a little bit there about playing against the decks that you think you're going to see at the tournament. Now, there are definitely decks that show up at tournaments a lot more than other decks, right? We've already named several of them. And it's totally good to practice against those. But the truth is, if you look at the combination of like Blue Farm, Rogside, Nagila, and whatever other, 3 or 4 decks that tend to show up the most at tournaments, that's maybe 15 to 20% of everybody who shows up. You could potentially play through a whole tournament and win and never bump into one of those decks. So, yeah, it is good to practice against those, but this isn't like, maybe a fighting game where, maybe 30% of the meta game is, one character and you can just practice against that character a bunch. So I think the thing you want to do the most is just get a lot of games and play a lot of different decks. Yeah, if you can focus a little bit more on the ones that show up more often, great. But another thing I tell people too is read the decklist database. At some point, you should sit down and probably read every primer on the decklist database, just so you know what's out there and what people can do. You're in a tournament and somebody pulls out, I don't know, Emery Lurker of the Lock, and you say to yourself, I have no idea what this deck does. Something with artifacts. If you've read the primer at least once, you might get yourself a little more information, might pop into your head and say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, they do. I mean, this is a bad example because I don't freaking know what that deck does. But you get the idea, right? Had I read the primer, I would not have flubbed the podcast right now. Or, you wouldn't have flubbed the tournament so much. So,
for those of you who don't know, they do artifact stuff with graveyard and getting that value. So if you have like a rest in peace that impacts the Emery a ton, or if you have oof, obviously. So,
well, yeah, I mean, you can get that much by reading the card. I was
trying to go read Emery, bro.
Like, what exactly is the combo? If I was going to play Phyrexian Revoker, what should I name to stop the combo?
Well, Emery, I'm going to be real, probably Emery.
Like I said, terrible example. You can just leave the last minute. I screwed that one up pretty
it's Lion's got Diamond, isn't it? Lion's Diamond or Lotus Petal, one of those 0-cost mana rocks. Yeah.
I think the practice is a really important thing, and this is something that I've definitely been trying to work on. I am mega stressed anytime anyone puts me in a position. Well, I say anyone. Whenever I put myself in position to go for a combo, right after an Adnors, I'm sat there and I'm just like, I can't do this. How am I supposed to do this? What am I supposed to do? I played a ton of Magda, but you asked me to like go through the combo. I'm like, I've got Clock on the field. I've got Magda. Please don't ask me. Please don't make me do it. But if you get that practice in, it becomes second nature, and performing a lot of these things under pressure, because you will be under pressure. We talked about the time limit earlier. I think Neko mentioned that. You will be under pressure because people are going to be asking questions. People are going to be obviously trying to stop you. You need to be ready to deal with that kind of thing. And practice is what gets you there, right? It gets you into the right position to pick up your wins.
If you play Gitrog, make sure you know the combo.
Don't play Gitrog. That's the answer. Don't play Gitrog.
But that's it. Players are going to ask you to play it out. They're going to make sure you know what you're doing. Even if they know you have the win, they're going to make sure you don't mess it up.
Yeah.
They're going to take every out that they can get. So knowing your own combos, your Adnos lines, what have you, is going to be really important. And then when you get to a tournament, you know your deck, you're good. Know what you can. You're not going to know everything, but don't be afraid to ask your opponent, hey, what does this deck do? What do I need to look out for? You can communicate with the people there to try to figure out a game plan. They're going to help you stop an opponent. They're not going to help you win in most situations.
Yeah, so to put one very important point out there that I don't think we've said yet is if you are new to the format and you're not sure what to play, you should definitely err on the side of playing something proactive, right? Because it doesn't matter as much what your opponents are doing if you just have the ability to drop a win on a moment's notice, right? Your opponents can be trying to, put this together and that together, and if you can just say, well, I don't care what you're doing, Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation ignores that, that's going to be very powerful for anybody, but especially a new player who doesn't understand all the intricacies of other decks. I would not recommend you start this format with stacks, or even necessarily mid-range. I would definitely err on the side of being proactive until you understand exactly what's going on and how to take it apart. Then if you want to try something a little more reactive, a little more locked down, then I think you're in a position to do that.
And we've talked about, obviously, practice is the number one thing. If you can get in hundreds of games, that's fantastic. But I do think there's a certain thing to be said about having good practice.
Yeah.
Not all practice is equal.
It is not. Thank you. The phrase "all practice is good practice" is a vicious lie.
When it comes to putting in games, put in the games. It allows you to work through, if you're playing a turbo deck, if you're playing an Adnaz deck, just having time where it's okay, you've drawn this many cards, you've played through your Adnaz, now figure out the line. Having that experience is valuable.
It is, and it's good, and even having it where you talk to your opponents, kind of that rule zero, hey, I want to play this like it's an actual tournament, set that timer, and go from there.
But I think there's also, the reason why earlier I brought up, if you know people that are good at decks you're expecting to see, then you want to play against them, isn't because you should only play against meta decks. But if you're preparing for a tournament, regardless of the game, you want to prepare against things you're expecting to see. Because let's say you're prepping and you're playing pods with a small group of people, and the only decks those people play are Urgi, Brick, and Yeva. I don't know.
I mean, you're harsh on the monocolor, but for every blue farm, there seems to be a monocolor colorless deck that takes a win to beat your Magda, your Teferi.
No, I would put Crick as a very good deck. I'd put Berkey and Yeva as not too bad. They can take games. But if they're the only thing you play against, that's a problem.
That's true. I mean, I was going to say they can take games, but I think it's always kind of how often they do. I think Crick's a really interesting one because I think it really does do that proactive well. And I think it's a really interesting one to kind of play. And I think it's one that falls often in I think all of these decks in particular, obviously, are often comfort picks, right? And I think Crick is one that has done surprisingly little in the tournament scene. Honestly, I expect someone to have a hot streak and do really well with this at some point. This is just an aside. I'm looking forward to that one standout Crick performance. It'll be cool.
I actually have a friend who plays Crick like that, and I swear they must have 5 mana crypts in their deck or something because they get those turn 1 wins all the time.
I mean, forget how good the decks are for a second. You're just almost certainly not going to see that. How many Cricks have we had total in the entire Ka0s series? I could probably count it on one hand. Now, it's good. It doesn't hurt you to know how to play against that. But a game with 3 monocolor decks that are not blue is not going to go anything like the vast majority of cEDH games, where I would guess at least 1 or 2 players is blue, for example.
It's the point is, if you are playing against a narrow field, make sure that narrow field is meta.
Yes.
Because if you're playing only against Fringe, you'll know that matchup really well, and other people might not, you're not going to know the main thing you run into, and that's a real big problem.
That's absolutely true. And because another big part of doing well in tournaments, especially as you play longer, you go into more tournaments, is knowing how to not necessarily counterpick, but pick pieces of your deck that can counter. For example, when we saw the rise of Winota, we saw a very big increase in cards like Graft Digger's Cages, being able to tech against the top decks.
Yeah, I'd say let's talk about tech here, because we've been talking a lot about our broad choices as far as, okay, here's like, you want to practice against meta, you want to be aware of fringe, but if you are going up against decks and you know roughly what you're going to be going up against, you know the meta, you don't necessarily have to change your deck completely in order to bring cards to counter them. Now, we are a singleton format, and so it makes it harder to tech, but we do also run a ton of tutors, depending on the color, obviously. Um, if you're in a good color, you run a ton of tutors. um, and so it makes tech choices more impactful, but it's still, it has limited. So if you're just putting in one card, it may not be as impactful, but tech choices still really matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think having those silver bullets is always really nice, and things that are just prepared for it. I think one thing that was touched on earlier was the Narset and stuff like that, and I really like this as an example because we've been seeing a lot more Rogsai lists, for example. Rogsai, obviously a turbo list. It wants to go fast as anything, but it also runs a lot of wheels as a result. And I think alongside that, alongside the fact that you're getting a lot of decks that want to draw a lot of cards, play that kind of more that slightly slower game plan of just accruing a ton of value, running these cards which allow you to deny those extra draws is absolutely fantastic, really synergistic and a great tech in, and something which maybe you guys could look for in your decks, in your pet decks, or whatever list you're kind of playing. Running something like that is a great way to counter the meta and also still get that double up, get that extra value out of it.
Yeah, and something we saw a little bit in the last event. So we've been kind of, at least me, I've been beating the drum a little bit that there are not enough creature removal in this format. The creature decks are doing really well in the tournaments because there aren't enough people running cards that answer them. I think in our last event, at least at the time of recording, I saw a lot more Toxic Deluge in decks. And I think that's a good example of tech. You realize that, decks with 20, 30, 40 creatures have been doing well. A lot of these creatures are stacks that'll stop your turbo plan or even sometimes your mid-range plan from working very well. A card like Toxic Deluge is an excellent choice right now, or to a lesser point, Culling Ritual, although that one's a lot harder to support in decks because you often mess your own plan with it. But like that's kind of right now, I think, where the tech is.
I agree. And it's not even just necessarily teching for decks you may face. It's also teching to the environment that you're going to be in. For example, we've seen a shift pretty recently to the 90-minute rounds, no turns, as opposed to the 75 minutes with turns. And with that, there have been some changes in the types of decks we've been seeing, at least when it initially switched. When we first made that change, a lot of people were trying to tech in stacks decks. A lot of things like Drevi saw play. I think we saw like 3 Derevi decks in that one tournament.
Yeah, Derevi definitely saw an uptick, which weird. I understand they've gotten some recent pieces, but like it's still that talking about a fringe deck. That's up there.
But it's the idea of knowing what you're walking into, knowing how many rounds are going to be, knowing what the event's going to look like, and bring that into your strategy a little bit as well. Know like how many wins you're going to need, how many points you'll need, know when you can take a draw, and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the biggest example of something like this is rule of law decks.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's a common statement that rule of law and rule of law effects are generally the strongest stacks pieces you can run. There's hardly a deck in this format that plays well through a rule of law. The problem is rule of law decks don't tend to win rounds in 75 to 90 minutes in most cases. So that's another example of where in the tournament you're not going to see as much rule of law as you might in a setting that is untimed or more casual, I suppose. And I think to tie that into something from earlier, I think that's a big part of the reason that Food Chain is back. There are basically 2 stacks pieces that ruin Food Chain: Drannith Magistrate and Rule of Law.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people got caught up in the Food Chain loses the Rule of Law, and then they eventually realized, oh yeah, but nobody brings that to tournaments because they don't want to end the day 0, 1, and 2. And there's very little in the way of these creature-based stacks decks that really hurts the Food Chain. There's some lesser played pieces, but I mean nobody is good against Drannith for the most part. So you can handle a Drannith in a Food Chain deck. but if you don't have to deal with rule of law, I think that makes that one a lot more solid.
Well, and even if you are playing one of these top meta decks, you can still tech to try and beat whatever the counter pick is. So like
Lavinia in Blue Farm.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was about to bring up. It's Blue Farm is mid-range. I mean, there's a whole conversation about that. We're not getting into it right now. Don't have time for it.
Kuma with the
Yeah, we do a podcast on his Blue Farm mid-range, so I can finally get my rant off my chest that no, it is not. At least not in the way people think it is.
And we'll actually talk a little bit about what mid-range is for our format. But Blue Farm is, I'll say, in the mid-range space, even if it's not definitively a mid-range deck. And so as a part of that, it kind of struggles in the rock, paper, scissors. Actually, you know what? We're going to interrupt this because I'm talking too much about what is like the rock, paper, scissors of our format as far as archetypes. So we're going to talk about that right now. I was planning on talking about it later. It's too late. We've already gotten into it. So for other games, other formats, usually you'll have a mix of different things. So like if we're talking about 60 card formats for Magic, you typically have aggro, mid-range, control. If you're talking about like fighting games, for example, you have rush down, grappler, zoner, and then you've got the Shoto character in there as well. And then even for shooting games, depending on like if it's a team-based shooter, you'll have to some extent this general idea in that as well. Like Overwatch has that for an example. Not getting into that, it's complicated.
I think it's a great analogy to have too, but one thing to keep in mind with it is you're playing against 3 other people, so people may bring 2 rocks and 1 scissor, and you're going to have to try to work your way around that best you can.
Yeah, MacGyver an answer out of paper.
But with cEDH, you have Turbo as basically our aggro, our rush down. You try to win as fast as possible. Typically, your Turbo Nas, which is relying on ad nauseum in order to draw you a ton of cards and win you the game with whatever you get from that. You've got Stacks, which is basically our control. Technically, control decks do still exist, but they're way harder because of the fact that we're a 4-player format. And so it makes it very challenging to shut down the whole board. So instead of that, we run Stacks, which basically makes it harder for everyone to play the game, either by limiting people to only playing 1 card or making things cost more or whatever. And then you've got mid-range, which basically you want to play for more value. You don't necessarily want to drag the game out super long. And typically you'll have some fast ways of winning, but you have a lot of value pieces that you can rely on to win when the game goes a little bit longer. And as most people have the rock, paper, scissors, so do we. General rule, obviously, it's not a 100% of the time this is how it works. You've got Stacks beating Turbo, Turbo beating mid-range, mid-range beating Stacks.
Yeah, that's generally how that works, although, you know, there are definitely opinions about how well that works.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, that is basically correct, I would say, yeah.
In a vacuum.
So with Lavinia, you've got Blue Farm that gets Lavinia, which is a Stacks piece, going into a mid-range, even a slightly turbo mid-range deck, and using it in order to kind of stop other people from winning faster than them.
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting thing, right? We got these. I believe Lavinia is one-sided.
Yeah.
It is,
So
yes.
it doesn't hit everyone. That's a big thing. Like, you can see these tools, which are obviously, they're pretty much Stax tools, but they can go into other decks. And I think, again, the format is very fluid with its definitions of these kind of archetypes. Obviously, certain things are very turbo. And I think, again, to go back to Rogsai I was talking about, I'll tell you what, Narset is not a particularly turbo card, but it still goes in some of these turbo decks because you can attack on different angles. There's a lot of flexibility. And I think we were talking about decks in terms of knowing what kind of things people are bringing. It can make it so really hard sometimes when people are flexing around some of those flex slots in very weird ways, but it also gives you the ability to do the exact same thing with these kind of tech options we're going to talk about.
Oh yeah.
And that's important too, because unlike a lot of the other Magic formats, we're a best of one in a tournament setting. You are sitting with 3 other people. You don't have 3 rounds to try to get a 2-0 or 2-1 win. You have one chance to get the win that round, and you don't have a sideboard. You don't have a chance to tech your deck in between rounds. You sit down, and that's it, and you just have to hope that you're ready. And you can't even make changes in between rounds in most Commander events. Your deck list is set for the day in, so it's really important to make the best choices out of those slots ahead of time.
Yeah, you can't have a counter pick in your pocket that you pull out in order to specifically beat whatever deck you're facing. Whatever you're locking in, that's your tournament. That is your deck for the day. You can't be like, oh, I may be playing Blue Farm, but I've got a Rogsai just for this one matchup. That's not how it works. You can't even swap individual cards. Counterpicking is all done before the day.
Yeah, and that's basically what the Stax decks are designed to do. You bring your whole toolbox with you, and then you run some kind of tutor engine or a bunch of tutors to go and find the exact one that you need to win at the moment. At least the kind of Stax decks I like tend to be built that way. Some of the lower color Stax decks, I'm like, how do you ever find the piece you need to shut your current pot, and you just mulligan?
Yeah,
redundancy.
or you tutor for it by sacrificing 5 treasures.
Seems slow.
It might be.
It might be a little bit. Sometimes it's not slow.
Yeah, Dockside makes it very unslow. But that's an aside.
The mulligan is definitely a huge part of our format, and you can almost counterpick with your mulligan, where you're searching for these specific cards.
I think an important thing about that, and I hate to be going back. In fact, I'm not going to use Rogsai as an example. This time I'm going to talk about Winota, right? Is again a deck that is very format warping. I think part of the reason why Kuma's like, run more removal, run your board wipes. Okay, and if you are, mulligan for them if you know you're going up to a situation where you're going to have to use them. Have access to it. Let's say there's some real problematic cards going on, a Pithing Needle or a Revoker like we were talking about before. You need to know what you have to deal with, right? You need to be ready for the kind of threats and pressure that you're going to be dealing with. When you're dealing with a Winota, you need to be able to kill Winota or stop the ball from starting rolling.
Yeah, exactly. It's not enough to just run the answers. You have to have the answers. I don't know how many games I've lost.
You need the cards in your hand. Wow, crazy.
Yeah, you would think, but like, I don't know how many times I've lost to Winota where like I mulliganed into a Gilded Drake. I tried to Gilded Drake the Winota. They like flashed in Solitude or something and stopped it. And then like the rest of the table just sits there and goes, shrug. I don't have a creature answer. And then after the game, they're like, but see, look, I run like 12 ways to answer Winota. I'm like, that's great. You didn't have any of them.
Yeah.
And that's hard. You can't always guarantee that you'll have...
Yes.
Yeah, but you have mulligans. You have to aggressively mulligan to try to find that answer, especially against certain decks. And that's another aspect of it too. Being able to sit down and recognize what decks, okay, I really, really need to get a piece to try to stop this. When I think of that, I think of like a Nala, a really scary, fast deck that can go on turn 2. So you see that deck, there are decks you really have to respect in those mulligan thoughts.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just mulligans are really important, but even knowing the meta ahead of time. Like there's 2 aspects to it, the prep and then the actual game day. We talked about game day with mulligans. Knowing the meta is really important. That's easier when you're playing in a local event with people you know. You can have a general idea of what decks you can expect them to bring. In a blind meta, with a bigger tournament like a Chaos event or something like Oktoberfest, it's a lot harder because a lot more people bring a lot of different things.
Hmm. Well, and a lot of the best players are the players that can predict what the meta is going to be. So you can make those counter choices accurately, whether it be full deck choices or tech choices where individual cards are swapped. And you can predict that accurately according to what you expect the meta to be.
Not to get too off topic here, I think that's a part of it, but I think the number one thing that separates out the repeat tournament winners is their ability to politic and manipulate a table, or to read a table. Do I force of will this stacks piece, or do I have a pretty good feeling that one of the two people going before me is going to handle it, kind of stuff. That to me is what really sets people apart. Yes, it is definitely knowing what might be there and preparing for it with your deck, but these meta games are so wide open and undefined a lot of the time that I think there's a limit to how much advantage you can get by doing that. Whereas with politicking, that's as long as humans have human nature, that's going to get you somewhere.
And I think that's a boon of the format too, is a lot of the win pieces, a lot of the major threats are universal across decks. You know that if a deck's in black and blue, it's going to most likely be running the Ka0s Oracle packages, so you can keep an eye out for that. But that's the idea, right? At least you can recognize some of the common threats in between from deck to deck.
Yeah.
You would not believe how much pushback I get playing 5-color stacks. Is why are you running Thoracle in your stack stack? Really?
Why wouldn't
Oracle
you?
wins games.
Really?
See, I'm gonna
What
get
if you have a stacks piece out that stops it? What if I don't? I'm gonna do the Scott Seiss thing here. What if I don't have the stacks piece?
See, you say that. I don't run Thorgal in my 5-color Sisay deck, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, just in general, it's like I understand there may be a reason not to do it, but the people who just take that as like for granted that like, oh yeah, you're playing stacks, you can't run Thoracle. It's like,
Yeah, you need a reason to not play it, not to play
you need
it.
a strong reason not to play it, not a reason to play it. Your reason to play it is you're in blue and black.
Exactly.
That's the only reason you need to play that card. That's it.
Yeah. But a lot of this comes down to, it's like there's some obvious deck choices, but there's a lot of things where it's like fine little details, fine little number games where it's okay, you've got this many flex spots in your deck, this many spots that you can swap these cards in and out depending on what you're expecting to face. And it's figuring out, okay, of these cards, what is most valuable for what I'm expecting to face. Because we're talking about, like, right now in our meta, as far as like the broader blind meta for cEDH, currently we've got creature decks on the return. So creature decks are coming back. They are starting to be impactful again, and people are starting to adjust accordingly. But a couple months from now, that might not be the case. And so it's all about acknowledging what is expected to be there, figuring out what the best tools for stopping that is, and bringing that.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna, I posted it in the chat as well. I was gonna say Return of the King with the creatures. I'm a big fan of creature decks, but yeah, I mean, properly kind of understanding that, I think we're gonna kind of have, especially since the meta's kind of, it's not, I don't want to say stale. In fact, I don't even remotely think it's stale, but it's kind of subsided. We do see this kind of ping pong back between decks going, okay, well, there's a lot of creatures, let's run creature removal. And then going, oh, because no, everyone's running creature removal, no one's playing creature decks. And then we kind of see it go back and forth and back. So you've got to be able to properly pass that one and kind of understand where you are. And always kind of having a grasp on the meta by consuming content, by reading tournament reports, by checking up on some of the resources that we have available to, and seeing how those tournaments have really gone. As well as kind of seeing what cards have come back into vogue, what cards have been released in the recent set, and people are going, oh, this card's really cool. I'm going to play it so that this deck will now be kind of coming back to the fore again. It's always kind of playing with these ideas and trying to figure it out. And it's a lot of information that kind of comes towards it that allows you to understand how the meta is going to go.
Exactly. And I think the meta is actually in a pretty healthy place right now because you have those 3 strategies that we talked about, and each one kind of has its place right now. There are popular decks, but I don't think there's one meta-defining predominant deck. Blue Farm really good, but it's nowhere as prevalent as I think Flash Hulk was back in its day.
Oh, if you were playing Flash Hulk back in the day, something was misfiring in your head. There was no reason not to play a deck that could do that. Like, people built some decks that did okay against it, but like, you could just join the club and win. So I don't know what they were thinking, but that's definitely not the case now.
Yeah, right now we've got a really open meta, got a lot of options that you can do. And it does make counterpicking a little bit harder to some extent, but you still, as we're talking about, it's like, okay, if you're expecting a lot of creatures, you can bring stuff that are good against creatures, or whatever it happens to be at the time.
I do want to also highlight too, we kind of talked about it before, but also just preparing yourself, as well as, knowledge is power, but taking care of yourself before a tournament will pay off really well. Getting a good night's sleep, having a good breakfast, drinking your water, packing snacks. There's a lot more prep that goes into a tournament day outside of the magic itself.
Well, and as we were talking about with earlier, it's like, make sure you're having fun. That's even for people that are doing this professionally. If you're looking at like esports, for example, the people that are doing that as a full-time job, if they aren't having fun, they don't win for very long. And so they either retire or they get fired.
Yeah, it'll just be too hard eventually to get the motivation to keep putting in the practice you need to stay at a high level if you're not on some level enjoying it.
I don't know, the thousands of dollars are pretty good motivation, though, a lot of the time.
Yeah, but they're not as good motivation as thousands of dollars and enjoying what you're doing.
Yeah, you think the money would be enough, but like, looking across all of these different games, you have time and time again where it's, this person should be the best player, and they just aren't enjoying it anymore, and they stop winning. Just straight up. You see this regardless of the game. You see this in, like, whether it's a team game, whether it's individual game, whatever it is. If they're not having fun, they stop performing as well. Because it's just hard to put in that much passion when you hate every moment of it. But as we're coming to a close of this time of talking about what it takes to take something good to a tournament, because it's not just about making the right choice, it's also about the preparation and being able to prepare your mind, being able to, as you were saying, Neko, have good breakfast beforehand, which makes a difference for just your mental sharpness. I feel like I should go into some ad here, but we don't have one.
Sponsor us.
Yes. But no, as we're coming to the close here, we'll be going for our closing segment of Bed Wed Dead.
You know it, you love it, you've been waiting for it.
We're going to be doing one a little bit different than our previous. Instead of doing cards, we're going to be doing archetypes. We've been talking about the different archetypes here. And we're going to be doing turbo, stacks, and mid-range. I already have an expectation for at least one of the choices made by Kuma, so since we all know that you are a simp for stacks, would you like to start us off, Kuma?
Well, if I'm a simp for stacks, that means I never get to bet it, right? And I definitely don't get to wed it.
Fair enough. You can be married if you want.
Okay, but yeah, in all seriousness, as serious as this segment ever gets, yeah, I'm going to wed stacks. I think that might be the least surprising thing you're going to hear anybody say in this podcast. But yes, and really that's just a personal thing. I'm not going to tell you that playing stacks is going to lead you winning more games of Magic than if you play turbo or mid-range. It probably won't. Just look at the top results of recent tournaments, or any tournaments really. You know, maybe a Winota or something weird squeezes in there, but the top 16 is pretty much always some variation of turbo or mid-range for probably 15 or so of the slots.
The number one thing that playing stacks does is it teaches you how to play against stacks.
Yes, I will say that. Playing stacks will make you a better Magic player, though. You know, if you pop off an ad nauseum on turn 2, what have you learned? You've learned that your deck can pop off an ad nauseum on turn 2. I'm not saying that means you're a bad player if you play that deck. I'm just saying You're not going to learn as much, winning on turn 2 with an ad nauseum than you are by casting an Imperial Seal on turn 1 and trying to figure out exactly what you're going to need to shut everybody else out going forward. So to me, I think it makes me a better Magic player. It exercises my mind muscle more. It feels a lot more challenging. It makes the wins more sweeter when you do get them. Is that the number one way to tournament success? No, but that's what I'm going to wed. So I need to bed and I need to dead. I'm gonna bed mid-range because if I'm not playing stacks, I am probably flirting with some kind of mid-range pile here. I like mid-range. If I'm having a bad day with stacks where my opponent's threat assessment is garbage, or I can't mulligan into the piece I need, or I do and then somebody removes it at the wrong moment, I need a break from that, I reach for mid-range. Mid-range is my booty call. All right, it's there. It's just a phone call away. I get to do proactive things. I get to actually take advantage of the windows people open instead of trying to slam them shut as quickly as possible. And I maybe win a few more games. I still get to exercise my brain. I got to, find the window that opens for me to win. I got to know if the moment's right. I got to know what my opponents are up to. And yeah, that can also be very enjoyable. So that means I'm going to dead Turbo. And I don't want to call Turbo brain dead, because it's not. I mean, in all honesty, it's not. You definitely need a certain level of skill to make that work. Now, you're going to get a lot more free wins with Turbo because you got lucky and just happened to have the turn 2 nuts with a Pact of Negation backup. Winning that way doesn't necessarily mean you're a good Magic player, but to me, it's just like, that's not how I want to win games. I've built decks over the years that were basically, I don't want to call them coin flips, but they were basically, I was relying on the deck to do the heavy lifting. I was relying on getting lucky and drawing fast combos, or I had Narset built for a hot moment. I was relying on getting lucky, flipping the right cards over, getting lucky, hoping I'd get a Lion's Eye Diamond or a Jeweled Lotus in my hand. And ultimately, it just wasn't satisfying to me, because at that point, did I win or did probability just favor me? And then you're going to have that a little bit no matter what you play. But to me, Turbo, you're asking probability to do you favors. I mean, maybe you get something else out of it, but to me, that's just not as satisfying as having to make a bunch of correct decisions over a longer game. So for me, at least personally, I got nothing against people who like Turbo. It's just not my flavor of Magic. So I'm going to dead Turbo.
Kuma's brain is just so swole.
I try.
Yeah,
No, go.
Oh, sorry. I was going to jump in here.
So
if you wanted to rib on Kuma a little bit longer, be my guest.
Please rip on me. That's fun. That's fun listening.
No, I just want to come in here and defend Turbo a little bit, as
don't worry, I'm on that. If you get in my section,
like I'm gonna go first here. We can get to Rook shortly, but I just want to defend Turbo because I don't know about anyone else, but I'm personally okay playing a deck that wins for me. Like,
Yeah,
I want to play a good deck. That sounds good.
Well, to a point, yeah.
I am fine playing a deck that absolutely can win me games, and yeah, it still takes some skill. You still need to know how to make the odds work in your favor, but I have no problem having my better half be better than me. So I'm gonna be wedding Turbo here, and I don't mean to beat up on you, Kuma, but I will absolutely be killing stacks. Like,
of course, you're a Turbo player.
Yeah, I am a Turbo player. Stacks is my enemy. That's just how it works. Stacks makes everyone sad, and I don't need that in my life. I understand there are certain people that find joy in making the rest of the table sad. That's not me. I'm good.
What's the rule about a player can concede at any time?
But yeah, I am not here for misery. I am not into that personally, so absolutely killing stacks. And that leaves the mid-range as my bed. I mean, mid-range is pretty solid. I personally look for someone a little bit more, I'll say strong-willed in my long-term relationships. But mid-range has a lot that they do really well. And so I'm not gonna diss mid-range. Mid-range is great. Absolutely my bed.
Well, okay, I'm gonna go for mine, and I'm gonna get this out of the way. Mid range, more like bed range, but not as in bed as in the context of this, but more like
The
Because
snoozer.
man, mid-range, it's just not my thing. I liked playing like some Jund decks and like Abzan decks, like junk style decks in like modern. But I'm just not here for any sort of mid-range piles in cEDH. They've got some stuff going on for them, sure. If you like to spin some wheels, they certainly do that. And if you like sitting there with a fidget toy where you're like, I can use Thrasios, go for it, buddy. Enjoy your time. But for me, it's in the dead. I ain't messing with it. I'm not here for that. Now, the interesting thing comes in here because I've kind of got this situation where, at my heart, I am a mono red burn player. But also, I'm a red player in cEDH, which means, and I chose my path, right? I chose my path of playing Godo or Magna. I went for Magna. Obviously, it's not a hard Stacks deck, but I like Stacks a lot. I think it's a really interesting archetype. I think games where you're under Stacks pieces are some of the most interesting games of Magic of all time because so many interesting things happen. You get not the strangest necessarily, but definitely the most interesting scenario. People are like, oh, I love a six counterspell stack war. No, I don't care about that. That's not interesting. How about you guys try to resolve like 3 things, but you have to do it through a bunch of different pieces of stacks. It makes the board so interesting and in flux constantly. You've got a lot of things to think about. As you said, Kuma, it's not the best style of deck. And in fact, I think we were talking about the triangle, like A beats B, B beats C, C beats A. I think Stacks is definitely on the weaker end, at least at the current moment, especially in tournaments. But I still really enjoy it. It makes for really interesting games, and it really gets me there. And that's why I'm going to put it in Wed. But as of recent, I think this is perfect for this analogy. I'm going to go for Bed for Turbo. I've been playing a bunch of Tymna Jeska recently. Really interesting list. Love the access to Jeska. Jeska is a super cool card, which really allows you to play around with board states. You got access to some of the cool win cons. You got access to silences as well in that package. So really fun stuff there, and it allows me to kind of get that mono red burn style play. It is a little bit simpler than some other things, but you've got to apply that simplicity. You've got to get the most value out of that individual piece. You've got to be thinking constantly, I'm making minimal margins, but those minimal margins could be life or death, right? If I point this bolt face, or if I stop this creature from hitting me, or if I stop this thing here, it's a very similar thing, right? With like a couple of card draws here, a couple piece of removal towards the stacks with Jeska, for example, there. It again kind of puts me on the edge. I'm right hanging on the edge of my seat, similar to those Stacks games that I have to.
Yeah.
I mean, I just got to say, this is Bed Wed Dead, right? This is sexual metaphors. So Turbo players, I just got to ask you something. Is the best kind of sex where everybody whips it out and sees who can finish first? Or is it the kind that lasts a while as you try a bunch of different things out and create, new and interesting positions, let's say? I mean, you tell me. I don't know. I'm a simp. I don't get laid.
I might have to edit that out, but we'll see. Oh.
I mean, you could say the same thing for a marriage, right? Do you want it to be quick and over?
Yeah.
I have to go to work.
I mean, with Dead, I definitely do want it to be quick and over, though. So maybe I should put it that way around.
All right.
It's definitely an interesting take on that one.
Neko, come in, save us, please.
I'm not going to save anyone.
Neko's going to save us,
make it worse. But so let's start with Turbo. Like Kuma was saying, Turbo is the high-end escort. It's expensive as all heck, and if you blow your load too quickly, it's either over or you just sat there and it's awkward.
Oh.
But that's the thing, right? Turbo is the most expensive cEDH deck to build, most likely, because you need all the fast rocks. You need a lot of the high-end pieces to really make it move quickly and efficiently.
We're a proxy format. It's fine.
Well, that's the thing. Proxying is good in a lot of situations, but talking about tournaments, some tournaments don't allow proxies, and that can be difficult to play Turbo. So, it's too quick. It's not fun. It's there. It's over. I'm going to have to dead Turbo. Stacks is fun every once in a while. Stacks is a lot more of an experience. Stacks isn't going to let you finish quickly. Stacks is going to make you sit there and savor it. Stacks is going to keep you there and just beat you over the head with everything going on. You're not gone until it's over, and they say if it lasts more than 4 hours, call a doctor. There's no doctor in this case. There's no safe word. It's just there. And that's fine sometimes. There's a lot of grinding when you're talking about stacks, isn't there? And that's why I think I gotta say, gotta bed the stacks.
Oh my.
Mid-range. Mid-range is the best of both worlds. Mid-range, sometimes you get that little quickie in. Other times, it's experiments, a little bit more a night of fun. So it's versatile like that. And I think that's just the best for marriage. But mid-range is the strategy where you can turbo off, I think, in the right circumstances. But you can also sit back and thrive through those early turns until you get some sort of engine online and eventually go for the win. That pivot potential is something I really enjoy in a deck, and that's why I think it's something I am happy to commit to because it's my preferred playstyle.
I think we are closing out establishing that mid-range is in fact a switch. And on that note, okay, hard to recover from that. But
That's why we do it last.
Thank you so much for watching. Special thank you to all of our patrons. Like, the fact that this is something that just happened is all because of you guys. So thank you so much. I'm still recovering from that. Oh. And a special thank you to Frenchie at our Feldar Guardian tier. Thank you so much. Now, as for all of you, we had a very fun take on our Bedwed Dead. I would like in the comments to hear everyone else's opinions. You've gotten this far, you've committed, we want to hear it. Let us know your Bedwed Dead. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.